Hello plant friends, my name is Victoria and you're watching Plantastics. Today we're at the National Orchid Garden in Singapore. So I'm going to be taking you with me. Without further ado, let's roll the intro and let's get started. Today we are in the Singapore Botanic Gardens. After you come through and you've purchased your tickets, you're going to be able to see the crane fountain. So the National Orchid Garden is 3.5 acres and it's divided into 4 different color palettes. It also has a stage with like a lily pad pond around it, which I thought was really cool. The National Orchid Garden was part of the Singapore Botanic Gardens until 1995. The garden actually has a series of different areas, with one being the garden houses, the Yun Ping, the McNeese Bromeliad collection, Tan Hoon Siang Mist House, the enhanced VIP Orchid Garden. So the Simcourt Cool House is also included, and I have a separate video dedicated to that. And the Cool House is basically like a highland cloud forest type group of plants, so they really like it cool. So after we walked for quite some time, it was really rewarding to go inside because it is air conditioned, because that's the environment where the orchids live. So I was on my honeymoon for this trip. We spent 9 days in Singapore after being in the Maldives. And my husband knows that I love orchids. So we saw as many orchids as we could fit into our trip. So we went to the National Orchid Garden, and we also went to the Singapore Botanic Gardens. So for both of those, I would dedicate an entire day because there are so many orchids to see. Also, make sure you bring tons of water because you're going to be sweating a lot. So these are some of the most beautiful orchids I've ever seen. So if you didn't know this, I frequent as many botanic gardens as I can. I spent 3 days at Kew Gardens seeing everything. I've only ever gone to Kew Gardens internationally and now Singapore's Botanic Gardens and their National Orchid Garden. So I'm trying to gradually, through my international travels, go and see as many botanic gardens as possible, because the best thing about seeing these botanic gardens is oftentimes we have an idea in our head of how houseplants, or what we call and use as houseplants, are supposed to grow in our environment. And when you go to some place like this, where they have literal orchids hanging from trees and mounted to other structures, you really get to see orchids in a different light. Here they are literally thriving. In Singapore, there is pretty frequent rain and high humidity. So this is really great for the majority of orchids because most of them live in rainforests. So you can see here there's tons of dendrobiums. There were lots of dendrobiums everywhere, and vandas. So my knowledge of orchids is always growing. I unfortunately tried to get as many IDs as possible. However, there were some that did not have IDs that I could clearly see. So back to talking about going to botanic gardens. I highly encourage everyone to go to some. You don't have to try to go to everyone in the world. I would love to accomplish that in my lifetime. So whenever we go to places, like, we kind of get to see these plants that we have in our houses in a different light. So I remember when I was in Washington, D.C., and I think theirs is called the Botanic Garden. I could be misremembering, but I remember seeing alocasias, and every time I repot my alocasias, I bury them down because there's like a stalk on them that gradually increases as they grow. Well, in their gardens, they didn't do that. They planted it and they just left it there. I also got to see orchids grow to sizes that I would have never imagined possible, which is very refreshing to see because I don't know about you, but orchids don't always thrive with me. So I'm showing you highlights of the VIP orchid garden. This is the Kamala Harris orchid, which is very tall, very pretty, and you can see that it is just covered in blooms. This next one is very pretty. It's a dendrobium and it's got kind of like a purple throat to it. In this garden specifically, so there are orchids in the other garden here, the Singapore Botanic Gardens. There are orchids there as well, but I had never seen as many orchids in my life. Like, I honestly saw orchids like I didn't even know existed. I saw them in colors and patterns and sizes that I just had never seen so many different types of orchids. And it could be partly due to the fact that some orchids do better in Singapore than they would be, as houseplants. So there are probably a lot of orchids that I saw here that I just didn't see being sold as houseplants because they don't make good houseplants. So I really like how there is so much diversity. Also, there are people constantly making new hybrids. And unlike peonies, which take forever to create a hybrid of, which I learned recently, it seems like there are tons and tons and tons of orchid hybrids coming from here. So during my time at the orchid garden, I kind of just followed my nose, if that makes sense. And if I smelled something sweet, I would try to figure out which one it was. There was one orchid that just smelled so amazing. And what I would do was I would try to find the tags and the labels, and I would try to take a picture of it. Unfortunately, there were some without tags, or I didn't want to mess around touching the plants, basically to try to find a tag if I couldn't see it at first glance. But I say that to say that there were some that just smelled so great, and I went to look at the label. Well, if you've ever tried to navigate the phytosanitary certification sites, basically, you know that it's really hard to bring orchids from other countries into the United States. That is basically to protect our agriculture, and I understand the rationale behind that. I say that to say that I saw so many amazing orchids for sale in different shops and at different nurseries, but I couldn't take them back. So what I did try to do was I'd try to take a picture of the label, and then once I got home, I really tried to find them. Well, what ended up happening was that I would be able to find one of the hybrids, part of the parentage, but I couldn't find the hybrid. So I did purchase 2 different cattleyas, and I mean, I'll see how great they smell, but I'm really sad. I'll be very sad if the hybrid actually smells more fragrant than the parentage. But by the time it blooms, I'll probably have forgotten what it smelled like. So here are some of the orchids like I like to grow. So we have some nodosa, brassivola looking orchids. And I really got to challenge some of my conceptions about orchids. Like, I've only ever seen really large cattleyas, and there seem to be more compact growing varieties. I also just saw orchids that literally grew like moss on trees, not in the way that you think. Like, they were tiny. I think it was like a bulbophyllum. I think I'm saying that correctly. And it like covered it almost like a quilt. Like, it was one of the most cool things I'd ever seen. And that orchid specifically didn't have a label, but I did take a picture of it. It was just mind-blowing because I'd never seen anything like that. So here are several different orchids. This plant and its leaves were absolutely beautiful. Oh my gosh. I was just like, what is that? I think it's a philodendron. I'm not really sure. So this is the McNeese bromeliad collection. So if you're into orchids, you're probably into epiphytes and anthuriums as well. So this was a nice highlight. So the orchid garden doesn't only have orchids, as you can see. They have really great biodiversity. They also have endangered orchids, and I'm sure for good reason they didn't have a huge sign over them that said endangered. Here is one of the dancing ladies. So I have a miniature one of these. It's a miniature growing orchid, and it's a dancing lady, and it's actively blooming right now. So here are so many beautifully colored bromeliads, and I just like, my mind is literally blown. If I ever win the lottery, there will be signs. One of those will be me having my own garden that's a greenhouse slash botanic garden style. I really, really loved Singapore because they are the garden city. They have houseplants and greenery everywhere, indoors, outdoors, and it just is so much more calming than if you were to go to a really big city in the US. So if you're like a city planner, please plant more plants in your layouts of cities. I don't know what this was, but it looks really cool. So you can see they have Spanish moss and just so much green. So this is one of those queen air plants, which everybody has, but I've never seen one with its like leaves be long and curling. I think it's because most people, me included, set them on a flat surface so they just don't get the opportunity to like grow out, if that makes sense. There were so many beautiful, unusual orchids. Like it just, you've got to go there. If you're in Singapore and you love orchids, this is your place. So far, this is the place I've seen the most orchids, the most diversity. I mean, there was everything you could think of. They had the largest collection of novelty phals that I've seen. I don't really see a lot of novelty phals in collections. Here's a cute little dragonfly. So this orchid just looked so cool. It had these like curly looking petals. This one honestly didn't look like what I thought an orchid should look like. And here you can see those queen air plants just blooming like crazy. So out of all the orchids, these on this like rock wall were my absolute favorite because they had some really unusual looking ones. So they had this yellow one, and you can see it here. I think it's a bulbophyllum, and it just looked so odd. It was yellow and like a burgundy color, and it had these long like tassel looking things on it. This one was also just so beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. And this one almost looks like an antelope with its petals being twisted up. Here are some vandas. And you can see they have them in these huge pots. They just have them everywhere. And you may not be able to see, but if you really look closely, all of these orchids are not just freestanding. Like they are staked up so they don't fall over. And I never thought to do that. I have one vanda and it has grown incredibly slow for me. And I think it's because I don't water it enough and I don't give it enough light, but who knows? It's lived with me for like 2 years or more. I think we're going on 3. So this is the orchid that I loved so much. It smelled amazing, but I could only find... Actually, I think that's the one that I couldn't find any parentage of because the one that I'm thinking of was a cattleya and it was in the cloud forest room. Something else really interesting is they have cicadas, but unlike the southern US, they make this piercing, high-pitched sound, which you will be hearing in 3, 2, 1. Hello, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel in a different way, you can check my Amazon affiliate links. As always, I'll be seeing you next time. Goodbye.